Hello, everyone. Our topic is imaginaries, identities, and interculturality, students' views on educational practices in China. This will be presented by me and Professor Fred Dervin. Our research context is internationalization of Chinese higher education. China is the largest study abroad destination in Asia for some years, especially after 2013. So internationalization has been shifting from promoting China's modernization and opening up construction to enhancing global exchange and cooperation in higher education. So for our study, we have the case study, two students from the Netherlands. They are interviewed by Chinese students after their end of the sojourn studying in China. The interviews is about their educational experiences at a Chinese University of Commerce and Business.
And so, hi everyone. And so we have three keywords in our talk: identity, interculturality, and then imaginaries. So let me start with identity and interculturality. Now, as I have been saying in my work for quite many years now, interculturality is about change. It's about exchanges and changing what we are exchanging. And interculturality is a never-ending process. It's always about us together. What's interesting about interculturality, of course, is that it is governed, between inverted commas, by different continua and tensions of identity: liquid, solid, difference, similarity, powerless, powerful, single stories, multiple stories of self and other. And as we know now, identity and interculturality as research constructs cannot be separated. Next. Now, we have a problem, of course, with this idea of identity and interculturality being as they are, especially in relation to the tensions that I described. So how do we work with it? How do we look at the simplexities and the contradictions that they represent? How do we identify these simplexities, and especially how do we analyze how people deal with them? So what we do in our work is that we use a dynamic perspective called imaginaries. Next. So I'll tell you a little bit more about this concept of imaginaries. Imaginaries have been described, especially in the social sciences, as shared but also unstable cognitive schemas about self and other. So sometimes they are explicit and implicit ways of thinking about who we are and who the other one are. Sometimes they are questioned, sometimes they are unquestioned. And again, I mean, if I may use another continuum, imaginaries sometimes are very solid. So for example, if we take the idea of the stereotype, at the same time, they can be revised representations of self and other. And what we do with imaginaries, of course, is that they allow us to make and to shape the world in a sense. The world is very complex. We are very complex. So we use imaginaries in basically everything that we do to be able to deal with this complexity. And one final important element of the imaginaries, of course, is that they are always co-constructed, co-expressed, and co-negotiated with people in front of us, with people that we read, with people that we speak to online. So imaginaries are always the result of a co-construction. Now, to wrap up a little bit all about this, next slide, what's the connection between imaginaries, identity, and interculturality? Well, the way we co-construct identity and interculturality, so first of all, they always reflect ideologies. Now, that's another concept, minor concept that we use here. Ideologies here, we understand it as, I have put forward with Simpson 2021, how we are made to see the world by economic political forces. Now, imaginaries, they actually help us to make sense and to shape our intercultural realities, which means our identity and their identity. And through imaginaries, we actually construct ideologies, and we relate what we do, what we say, what we see to ideologies. And as many scholars have showed, these often lead to unstable discourses of centrisms or isms, such as ethnocentrism, believing that our country, our space is at the center, linguism, believing that our language is at the center and the best, ideologism, comparativism, etc., etc. We could summarize these as imaginaries of superiority. And now Selena will tell you about the methodology and the objective.
Yeah, our research context is internationalization in Chinese higher education. So our participants are the Chinese interviewers and the Chinese and international students. They are interviewees. They are talking about the international students are talking about their learning experiences in China. So our research objective is how students co-construct imaginaries of self and other, especially in relation to educational practices. So we use enunciative pragmatics for our methodology. Enunciative pragmatics is an individual who positions him or herself in interaction with others. Thus, it uses and manages discursive and pragmatic strategies to construct self, other surroundings, experiences, and so on. So for enunciative pragmatics, so in our study, that is how one places oneself in one's discourse when negotiating meaning and identities with others by Angermüller, 2014. So our the first case is the Netherlands student. She was interviewed by Chinese student. So we can see the analysis one, constructing course formats. Chinese student, she asked, so how do you feel about courses related to business? Then the Netherlands student answered like the way of described her learning experiences. So from this, we can see that so the discourse, in the discourse of the Netherlands student, she used the representative in the represent dialogues. She may use the very authentic and convincing pronoun they, like in China. And here they don't discuss the answer. They just give you get this wrong and this wrong, that wrong and this wrong. And then I'm like, why is it wrong? They don't tell you why it's wrong. So we can see they just talk about the courses compared in the Netherlands. They don't tell you what is wrong. And in Netherlands, they would say, oh, this is wrong. It has to be this. This is right now. And I also use the word like indicates the subjective, evaluative voice of the student. It's just like, yeah, you can learn this at home. Like, oh, that's weird. So talking about the Chinese learning experiences here. So here we can see the counter-imaginary. The Netherlands international students use here seem to mean China, opposed to the Netherlands. There are different educational institutions, teachers might have different practices. So this, from the dialogue, we can see this goes against the imaginaries of Chinese education, because the Chinese education as a stereotypes, as collectivist controlled learning, like compared with autonomous learning, we have the works like spoon-fed, this kind of education. However, you can see here is opposite. Seems like self-study in China is the guided teaching in the Netherlands. From here, the answer provided by the Chinese and Chinese students, and also you can see the right answers given in Netherlands. We can see the learning responsibilities placed on the student China to versus the teaching acts in the Netherlands, the quite opposite. So here the real issue is not the courses, the Chinese education. So we can see that she's complaining amount of homework. We can see the later from their dialogue. And so you mean the professors won't like answer the questions about homework in China? So they expect you to do more by yourself. They said they studied. So that's really a lot. So in Netherlands, they like to do everything in class. They discuss everything in class. And then the student continued. Here you can see they just
that's the second student.
The second student.
That's okay. So I'll take over. Yeah. So that first student, what's really interesting about her is that, you know, the way she presents her educational practice or experience of China goes against, you know, the stereotype of Chinese being told what to do and what to answer. But actually what she's experienced is that nobody's giving her answers to her homework, but she has to do it by herself. And actually what we discovered is that her real, as Salena just said, her real complaint is not about the fact that they have to be autonomous, but it's really about the fact that they have too much homework. So let's have a look at another excerpt. So that's the next slide. It's another student from the Netherlands. And he's talking about the teaching learning practice here. And of course, he says, you know, it's very different, you know, and he complains about the fact that, you know, in when Chinese students give a presentation, that basically they're not looking at the audience, you know, they don't know how to communicate, you know, they just read the presentation. Next slide. So this is more about, you know, what the teacher is not teaching, in a sense, the students to do. And he uses some exaggerations in the way he presents what is gone through in Chinese higher education. So for example, in the first quote there, so if you like talking all nonsense and it doesn't make sense, but you're confident explaining it, then you still get a good grade. So this is what he says about the Netherlands. So he contrasts China and the Netherlands and say, you know, in the Netherlands, it's all about the presentation skills. And what you say is actually, it doesn't matter at all. While in China, the focus is on what people say, but never mind if they are not really presenting or looking at the audience. And here there's a clear exaggeration, of course, about the Netherlands, the Dutch context. What's also interesting in what he says is that individuality is completely lost in the practices that he describes. So he uses, you know, exaggerating phrases such as Chinese people. He uses the generic you to talk about Dutch students, etc., etc. And what he does also is that he evaluates what a presentation should be about from his perspective. But unlike the first student, who was actually very critical of the Chinese practices of autonomization, this student actually tries to objectivize his criticisms of, you know, this teaching practice in China. And for example, he would say, you know, I'm not judging, that's different, it's way different, that's their ways and we have our own way. So for example, here we have two quotes. Chinese people during the presentation, they just read, they don't really present. Chinese people just read the presentation. They don't even look while presenting. It's just presenting this as a fact, but it's, you know, getting away from judging any of this in a sense. Next presentation, next slide, please. So he appears to be more balanced than student one in a sense. In terms of identity, he is different very clearly, but he seems not to be judging, not to be suggesting that his ways or what he sees as his ways in the Netherlands is better than China. However, when we look at what he said in more details, we can say that there are actually moments of what we call hyper-subjective evaluations of what he's gone through. So for example, when he says, well, the first thing is like, what do you go to? Who do you go to find help? We don't know where can, I mean, I can't really go to the teacher and be like, yeah, you are not doing good or something. So what's interesting about this student compared to the first one is that, you know, he seems to be stepping back a little bit and, you know, not judging, you know, he's evaluating, of course, he's telling the facts, and the facts are very different from what he perceives is the situation in Holland, but he doesn't directly, you know, like make a judgment, negative judgment about what he perceives as the practice in China. But when you dig actually into what he's saying through the enunciative pragmatics that we are using, you can see that there are snapshots actually of moments of potential judgments, but he doesn't go as far as the first student. Salena, back to you for the conclusion.
From the conclusion, from the two students, imaginaries reflect the view of interculturality. So we can see from their discourses that is not about the course, different course practices, not about their their teaching style or whatever. It's about interculturality. So the interculturality is about changes, exchanges. It is a never-ending process.
Except that in the data, it's not about changes or exchanges, but it's about solidity, difference, and single stories, actually. So this is the interesting point here, which is, this is about interculturality, but when they talk about what they experience, it's not about changes that they have experienced, but it's really about they stick to their guns. They go back to how they've done or they're doing it in the Netherlands, in a sense. Yeah. Tell us about the evaluations.
The evaluations in here. You can see these elements actually is governed by the identity. So that is, you mean it's about they're governed by identity, like solidity, difference, single stories of self and other, the imaginaries. So it is the direct, indirect evaluations, the science of objectivation of into students. We can see that.
I mean, what's interesting, of course, is because they are talking about educational practices. So of course they will refer to ideologies to evaluate the practices. So autonomy, you know, the way we are supposed to be doing a good presentation, etc. These are all related to orders, ideologies that they've been given back in their country, and then they use this in a way to evaluate what they've seen. And what we've seen, of course, is that the first student directly, she's evaluating, condemning, criticizing what she thinks are the Chinese perspectives, while the second student is somewhat doing it, but in an indirect way. Of course, what's interesting about the second student, and that we haven't said yet, is that the second student has himself a multicultural background, because part of his family was from Turkey. So he's actually Turkish, Dutch. Maybe this has an impact on the impression of non-judgment that he's giving, maybe.
Yeah. So, okay.
Next
so
slide.
we have, the last one. Imaginaries and the interculturality and the identity. So this is about what is good and the bad practice. This is interestingly, the usual imaginaries education about China and the Netherlands seems opposite. So the local practices are constructed as national ones. They're individuals, like student one, the school is private, expensive one, possibly in Netherlands, but she just used her, you can see, imaginaries or stereotypes to represent the national. So imaginaries about educational practices serve to evaluate education and the relations of self and other. In student one, we can see she criticized the Chinese, the classroom activities, like she complained the teaching style. So that is from this comparison, you can see indicates her country is constructed as a superior, as a better way.
Yeah, and the final words are on the last slide. So instead of focusing on culture, can you change to the slide, please? Instead of focusing on culture, maybe we will need to focus on what we call here educationism. The need for international students to be prepared to talk about educational practices, to contrast educational practices, to think about the ideologies that are hiding behind the ways we describe what is good, not so good, etc., etc. So we can go beyond centrisms, ethnocentrisms, linguisms, whatever, revise our judgments of educational practices, weigh the pros and cons critically, and then also dare and try out new educational practices when you go to another place. Instead of judging, just try and see. For example, student number 2 talking about presentations and saying their presentation skills in China are not good. That's an ideological judgment, actually, because the way people present, there's no international standard, and it's hard to say what is best or not so good ways of presenting. One point we didn't make, but which was important, Salena mentioned that the students were interviewed by a Chinese student. Of course, we need to bear in mind that the fact that the interviewer was Chinese, the questions asked by the student will have actually influenced the answers from the international students.
Yes.
And we always need to bear that in mind. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.